Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohanec, and we are back in action. Welcome to 2025. I'm excited to bring you a new year full of interesting content. I have some great interviews that I'm lining up and recording right now. I hope you had a good break, a good holiday, however you celebrate, and a good new year. And it's a new year, new resolutions. Perhaps you are going to try to hold to a resolution, or maybe, you're just trying to face a new year with a good attitude. That's good enough. So, I've been thinking a lot over the last few weeks, this holiday and into this new year, about what I can control. The world feels so out of control, and there's so much going on, the new administration coming in, and the world just so out of alignment. I'm trying to think of what I can control. And one thing I can control is how I live my life, what I do in my daily life that is going to be beneficial to the world, to the animals, to my well-being, to the state of our psyches collectively and on a personal level. And that is kind of what we're going to be talking about today. Today it is all in the family because I'm having my husband, Cogen, on again to introduce a new project that we are co-creating. It's the Ahimsa Living Circle. It's going to be an ongoing online gathering where veganism and spirituality come together. We've been wanting to do something like this for years, and the timing is finally right. It's a collaboration with my nonprofit, Compassionate Living, and Arihanta Institute, a Jain college where Cogen is a professor. And this podcast is kind of an introduction to us, to this project, to entice you to join us, hopefully. It starts with our personal spiritual journeys, and then we get into the project, what it's going to be like, how it's going to be formatted, the themes that we've chosen for the first few gatherings, and also the why we want to do this. Why we want to do this is we feel that it is deeply, deeply important to change who we are as a culture to one that focuses on compassion and kindness. We also start a philosophical discussion of how veganism can be a spiritual practice, what spiritual veganism is. So stick around to the end if you're interested about that. We finally start getting into that at the end. And I say that we start the conversation because there's just so much more to say about it. We just kind of skated the surface. But we will get more into it, deeper into it at the Ahimsa Living Circle. So, yeah, I hope you'll join us. It's going to be the second Saturday of every month, starting in January. January 11th will be the first one, and we're going to talk all about that. So, just a reminder about Cogen. I have read his bio before on past shows, but just a little bit about him. He has his master's in Buddhism, his PhD in the Dharma tradition, specifically Hinduism and ethics, and now he teaches Sanskrit and religious philosophy and other courses in Jainism at Arihanta Institute. Okay, let's now hear all about this new project, the Ahimsa Living Circle. Here we go. All right, let's get into our conversation today. Today we have Dr. Cogen Bohanec, who happens to be my husband and has been on the podcast numerous times now. I think maybe this might be your fifth appearance, possibly.
Sounds about right. Yeah, I think maybe.
Yeah, a few times. So welcome back, Cogen.
Why, thank you, Mrs. Hope Bohanec.
And it's always fun for us to do these episodes. And we have lots of different things that we have covered, personal things about our lives. The first one we ever did was about the animal rescues that we've done over the years, just different random situations where we've been in where an animal is in distress and we rescued an animal. And that I love that episode. A lot of people love that episode, actually. I get comments still about that episode.
Do they know that you've actually written a song about those rescues as well, too?
Yeah, probably not.
The song is called Concrete is Temporary.
Concrete is temporary. That's right. Uh, so yes, Cogen and I do music together. Maybe that's something we could talk about one day. We do kirtan, spiritual, devotional music, and other folky type music. I play harmonium. Cogen plays guitar, but that's a whole other thing. That's not what we were going to talk about today. Today, we wanted to talk about a new project that we're co collaborating on, the Ahimsa Living Circle. So, since you've been on the show before, we've talked about a lot of our personal journey, our marriage together, and things like that. But what we thought we'd talk about today that we haven't really gotten into is our personal spiritual journeys. We came to where we are together now with the spiritual journey we're on from very different places. So I think it would be very interesting to hear our separate journeys and then how they've come together. So I'll start, and then you can jump in with your story, and we'll see where that goes.
Okay, that sounds good. Tell us about your journey, Hope.
All right. So interestingly, I think this is always interesting about us is that you were raised atheist and now have become a very spiritual person. I was raised Southern Baptist, born again Christian, going to church with my grandmama. And then I went atheist, or maybe agnostic would be a better description, in my teens, early 20s. And then when we got together, in our 20s, you were a very spiritual person. I was basically atheist. And that was okay. We were,
But I will say that you were still the most spiritual person that I'd ever met.
aw. Yeah, well, in ways that we define spirituality. Yeah. So it was interesting that I was totally fine with you being spiritual because I had been around spiritual people my whole life, with my family being very deeply religious, some of them being very deeply religious. So I was fine with that, and I was like, that's if that's what some people need, that's just fine. I'm fine being atheist over here. But when I would learn about things that you were reading about or thinking about, and we'd start talking about what you were into, and you were into Gandhiism and Buddhism, and these things that I had never been exposed to as a Christian. It was very different, and it was like, wait a minute, this can be spirituality. This what I didn't really understand that there was a completely different way to be spiritual, and that there were so many different paths and so many different religions, and I just loved what the Dharma traditions offered. It was so beautiful to me, this reverence for all life, this connection to the world in a way that goes beyond humans. And that, had not been introduced to me before. So,
You
yeah.
could tell us a little bit about how what happened in between that. Like you were raised Christian, and at some point you moved away from that. Like how did that happen? And then what did your sort of atheism look like, and how did you move away from Christianity? And what role did Christianity still play and influence you even maybe today?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I loved my Christian upbringing, actually. In my elementary years, I loved the community. I loved the love of Jesus, like feeling that Jesus loved me, and there was a lot of love there. My grandmother was a very loving woman, and we had a wonderful time going to Sunday school and going to church together. I loved all that. But there were little things here and there that were just confusing to me and did not really resonate with what I felt, even as like an 8-year old, were my values. Like I remember One time in Sunday school, I had a new dress, a pretty new dress. I was just kind of twirling the dress around and playing in the dress. And I got punished by a Sunday school teacher telling me I was dancing and to not dance, and said that dancing was a sin. And I remember thinking, I was just being joyful. I mean, really? I'm not supposed to be joyful? It was a very strange experience. And then, you started seeing the exclusionary nature of the Christian church, in that basically they believed that it was only the Christian white congregation of our Southern Baptist church that was going to heaven. Basically, that's it. Everybody else is not invited to heaven. So that was a little concerning for me. There were a lot of moments along the way before I was like 10 or 12 that it just really, I was like, no, no. And then the animals too. I remember having this deep love and connection to animals when I was very young. And I would even tell people that I was going to work for animals, that I was going to work with, like if somebody said, well, what are you going to do when you grow up? They ask kids about your career. And I used to say that I wanted to work for animals or with animals or help animals. I didn't know what that was going to look like, but I had that feeling at a very young age. And I remember that my grandmother would somehow, she didn't like that. And she would say to me, well, honey, just remember, animals don't have souls and animals can't go to heaven. And I remember thinking, I Grandmom, I think you're wrong. I don't believe that. I just don't, that doesn't resonate with me. So I moved away from religion thinking that that's all that religion was. That Christianity and what I was raised with was all religion was. And so that wasn't for me. And so I moved away from it in my teen years. I got into activism. I got into working with animals and feeling like that was my path. My philosophy was vegan, getting into veganism. That felt like that's what resonated in my heart, was being vegan. And that's where my values were, that's where my morality was. And I, felt like that was enough. I felt like that was enough. That was going to be enough for my life, until you came into my life. And then I realized that there was so much more, that there was just this other whole world of the Dharma traditions that has been opened up. And I just love it.
Yeah, I think it really says a lot about you that you had such strong values and convictions at such a young age, that you knew what was right and wrong in your heart, and that you had this strong gravitation towards helping animals and this strong sense that animals have a soul, that they're living beings and they're worthy of value in the same way that humans are. From the perspective of the Dharma traditions, I take that as evidence for reincarnation. When people have these very, very, very powerful senses of awareness or identity that seems to go against the cultural milieu in which they're embedded, in which they're born and raised. I think that that's really a profound sort of aspect about all of that. So that's one small point about evidence of reincarnation. I think we have others, because another point in evidence for reincarnation that I often think of is when you recognize somebody. You have that moment where you really feel deeply connected to somebody that you've like maybe just met, and you have sort of varying degrees of that sense of sort of affinity towards people when you meet them. And then I remember how powerful that was when you and I got together. It was
Yeah.
like we hadn't seen each other in a lifetime. And
Yeah.
I take that also as evidence for reincarnation. Now, when I say evidence, I don't mean like absolute, like must be, it's the only explanation, but I take it as like pieces of data that all add together to a larger picture of reincarnation.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. We often say that we feel like we have done this before, been married before, been partnered before, been together in some way. And it's just like we're going through another life together, because it feels so familiar and so easy. So, yeah, I love that. I love that you say that. So I want to hear about your spiritual journey, your story of how you came into spirituality, because you were raised atheist. This is always very interesting to me that we had kind of opposite journeys.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it is kind of interesting how I came to be so deeply religious and so deeply spiritual after my own upbringing. But I wasn't just raised atheist, right? I was raised like anti-theist. My
Mm.
father was a very, very opinionated man, to say the least. He had a real sort of hatred towards humanity in general. He was very, very misanthropic, a bit of a Nietzschean nihilist, and he despised religion and he despised all people and pretty much all human endeavors. But religious people were, just one particular object of his scorn. And I was raised to believe that religion was stupid and people who followed religion were stupid. But it wasn't long before I realized that my father was wrong about pretty much everything. And so it made me curious. But that took a little while, I was atheist all through my adolescence. I looked down on and debated with religious people when I was in school, in my high school. And actually, I lived like a really, I grew up in a lot of violence, a lot of domestic violence, a lot of violence at school, a lot of violence as an adolescent. I don't want to go into that too much, but that violence sort of left me feeling a lack of purpose in life and a lack of meaning in life. To me, life seemed like Thomas Hobbes' description of just brutality, where humanity was characterized by brutality. I didn't see a sort of future that I could be inspired by. I mean, I was something of like an intellectual nihilist, and I just didn't really see a world that had any value because, part of that sort of mindset is denying that there is any such thing as value. Value is just something that humans construct. You make up your value in the world. It's not really there. You kind of delude yourself into believing that life has value. And that came to a critical point where it was a dangerous mindset for me, and I was on a path of self-destruction. But my brother, Bonhomme, who I credit actually in the acknowledgments of my book for this, he gave me several books. He gave me a book on Zen by Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, Beginner Zen. He gave me some books by Alan Watts, and he gave me Louis Fisher's book on Gandhi. And I started reading those things, and all of a sudden it was like there was a light, there was a purpose, there was a value to existence. Value was like a real thing for me, and it was something that I could aspire towards to develop myself and to better myself. And it was like, giving a kid candy. I just went absolutely crazy for this stuff. And I started reading everything on Eastern philosophy that I could. I very quickly gave up all vices, kind of became like straight edge, but without the punk rock, like the hippie version of straight edge, I guess. I went vegetarian, and then within a year I went vegan, and then very quickly, inspired by Gandhi's asceticism. Gandhi's belief was that if he could bring his own mind under control, the sort of hostility of one's own internal conditioning under control, then that would release a potential from within the individual that was so great that it could change society. And that sort of social change beginning with an immense sense of self-control was an idea that really left an indelible impression upon me. And so I went raw. I stopped eating cooked food. I became a fruitarian, where almost all of my diet was fruit for 5 years, excessive fasting, exploring meditation, not sleeping indoors, only sleeping outside. That was a thing that Gandhi was into too. And I just became very, very, very austere. And my idea was that I would release that internal potential that would allow me to change the world. And it was right at that time that our spiritual journey started to intertwine. And I met you, and I took a look at you. And I always say that the reason I married you, the reason I fell in love with you, is because you were the closest thing to Gandhi that I had ever met. You were engaged in this profound social activism. You had tree sat, you had locked yourself to the gates of slaughterhouse doors to shut down the slaughter of animals. You were doing really, really radical activism, getting in the newspapers. You were organizing Sonoma County Earth First, Sonoma People for Animal Rights. And actually, here I was doing one half of the Gandhian program, which was the asceticism, this austerity, the meditation, the spiritual contemplation. But then you were doing the other side of Gandhian philosophy, which was the radical, dynamic application of nonviolence, ahimsa, in the social realm. And I took one look at you and I just thought, if ahimsa is part of the Modharma, the highest religious principle, the highest spiritual principle, then you are the most spiritual person that I've ever met. And that's kind of what I saw in you, even though you were a self-professed atheist. By my values and my understanding, you were anything but. You were profoundly spiritual. And so I started moving away from the harder austerities because I realized I'd kind of isolated myself in a bubble and it sort of made it, I wasn't driving a car, I was only riding a bicycle. I was not consuming anything new, which are values that you and I still hold today. But at the time, I was a little more extreme. I didn't use any soap, no shampoo, no toothbrush, no toothpaste. I would only shower with cold water outside. And I just kind of had created this little tiny, I'd isolated myself from society and I wasn't making any active dynamic change, which was Gandhi's understanding of nonviolence. Ahimsa is that's active and dynamic. And somehow it was so directed internally that I'd kind of cut off the external world. And so you were somewhat inspired by my path. You
Yeah.
seemed to think what I was doing was pretty cool.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you were so hardcore. I mean, I had never met anyone like you that you were raw, completely raw, eating fruit only, I think, at that time. And just everything you did, you took the moment to make a decision that was in the best interest of the world, really. I mean, it's like you wouldn't shower with hot water because of the electricity needed, that I mean, I was just so enthralled and so impressed and amazed at how you had taken your austerity to such a extreme level. It's interesting because we kind of balanced each other. I wanted to be more like that. I wanted to have the life that I was living, the choices I was making be more ecological, be more vegan for the animals. And even though I was already vegan, you were taking it to this level. And that was so inspiring. But I think that too, we realized that going to your level kind of took us to this, it takes you to this place of isolation and you're not making the change in the world that you want to make. We debated about a car because you didn't have a car at the time. And I was very inspired by that. But we also lived really far out in the woods. So and I did have a car. So we started sharing the one car. And, even though you made compromises coming back into the world, I think that then you were able to influence the world. I think that's kind of what you were.
Yeah, yeah, and you had this calendar, and all on your calendar every day you had some sort of thing where you were engaging. You were going to meetings, you were going to protests, you were organizing, you were using your phone tree to call people. We're doing was engage in society. And so I was very inspired by your calendar. And I thought, well, what natural propensities do I have? I wasn't very good in meetings and activism, or I was okay with protests. But what I really loved to do was study. And so that sort of engaged aspect that you showed me inspired me to actually go back to school and to dedicate myself as a student, because my idea was that through education, I would become some sort of educator, where then I would affect change in society as an educator, perhaps even more than an activist, which I think is where we landed today.
Yes, and I will say that you do brush your teeth now with some ecological toothpaste
Plastic free,
and
plastic free, no,
plastic free. That's right, plastic free.
no single-use plastics.
So, I feel like I kind of maybe pulled you back into the world, but you had inspired me so much to be very conscious and careful. And so we found this balance where, we could live life in a normal way, being able to be engaged in society, but also by making very ecological and spiritual choices, incorporating ahimsa and aparigraha into a household or life. Uh,
Parigraha meaning non-consumerism, for those.
right, right. What we have created together now, I feel, is just so beautiful. You have opened my heart. I mean, you've opened my heart to this beautiful world of spirituality. When I was in my atheist stage, I was very angry. I was really angry at the world, looking at the world from a materialistic, kind of scientific only perspective, especially when I saw so much suffering. It made me angry. It felt like it was so meaningless. And I was just so angry and hurt by the world. But then learning about the Dharma traditions, you see that there is this deep, amazing, ancient knowledge about, environmental protection and caring for each other and caring for the animals and the planet. And it gives life meaning, really. I mean, to me, it helps me to feel that there is a deeper meaning, a deeper knowledge, a deeper reason for it all, for this entire planet and our all the souls, all the jivas, and what we're going through. And it's just beautiful. It's beautiful to ponder. It's beautiful to talk about. And I love that I have you to go through this journey together with.
Yeah, it's great how we've both discovered our purpose together. And if I may make a slight philosophical point, I think the proposition of Dharma traditions and religion in general is that purpose is objectively real, like it's part of reality. We don't just kind of construct and make up our own purpose that we imagine, right? It's that like we can actually discover our true purpose in life, right? It's this part of reality through deep inquiry, through deep contemplation, you can actually find that purpose and you can sort of work towards having that purpose and that meaning in your life. And I think that's one of the things that religion does very well as a counterbalance to materialism. And materialism as a sort of scientific method, where we just look at we just decide that we're going to study matter, because we want to study how we can control matter, to create technologies and such. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a value neutral way of looking at the world, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. It has helped us so much in modern life. But just because we're looking at reality and only studying matter doesn't mean that matter is all there is. There's got to be a reason why matter matters. And that's beyond the scientific purview. It's a different set of truth claims and a different way of learning and knowing the truth, one that spirituality across the planet has excelled at since the dawn of humanity.
Yeah. And I always like to say this too, that, I know that we don't feel that religion has to be the way that we're going to save the world or whatever. That's certainly not, what we're doing. We're not preaching to be religious. It's just something that for us really resonates and really helps to move us forward to strengthen our resolve. So.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that some of the most spiritual people I've met are atheists, like you were when we some of the most spiritual people I know are atheists, and some of the least spiritual people I know are religious. So it's kind of a
Yeah.
but I still do believe that religion is a very good roadmap towards being deeply spiritual and really compassionate and actually living life's highest meaning, that is to bring compassion and love to all beings. I think that religion provides a very nice roadmap for that, but then it also provides a sort of structure of power where people can abuse that power if they want. So it's important to note that, we're not religious exclusivists.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Well, let's talk about our new project. Let's talk about the Ahimsa Living Circle. This is something really exciting that we are doing that is going to be a collaborative effort with Arihanta Institute and Compassionate Living. And it's something that we've been talking about for years. I mean, it's something that we've wanted to do in some way, some capacity. We didn't know what it would look like for years, but we've wanted to have some kind of a group of, community ongoing gathering together to talk about veganism and spirituality. So it's going to
and
be,
to practice spirituality and veganism.
yeah, and to practice absolutely spirituality and veganism. And it's going to be an ongoing monthly online gathering. And it's really to kind of support community. People that are veg curious, pre-vegans are welcome to come. It doesn't have to be that you're vegan. It's going to be a safe space encouraging, compassionate, and primarily focused, of course, in the Dharma traditions and particularly Jain Dharma. I'll just say something briefly about the Jains that I'd love to say, and that all religions have value. I feel if you can find value in all religions, and all religions have some level of nonviolence as a part of their philosophies. But there's something really unique and special about the Jains, their belief in ahimsa, nonviolence, and the value of all life, that all life has a soul. There's an individual soul in all living things, a jiva, and that jiva has the right to live without our interfering, right, with that life. It's just a level unseen, I think, in any other religion. And that's why vegans are so drawn to it, too, is that concept of nonviolence just really parallels with veganism. So, anyway, I'm very excited to be working with Arihanta Institute on this project. And I love the Jain religion, and I consider myself a converted Jain.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing to say, to try to describe the Jain emphasis on nonviolence and non-harming. As you said, all religious traditions have that emphasis to some degree, but I think even people from all the world's religions can admit that there's something particularly special about the Jain commitment to nonviolence. Even if those traditions are not willing to engage in nonviolence to the degree that Jains do, it's still admirable and it's still something that's noteworthy about the tradition. And I don't think that's really something that scholars or religious practitioners from any field or any tradition will sort of argue that, yeah, the Jains take nonviolence to a whole nother level.
Yeah, so the gathering is going to be the second Saturday of every month. So the first circle is going to start on Saturday, January 11th of 2025 in the new year. It's going to be 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern. And you can register through Arihanta Institute. We'll have a registration link in the show notes. And then we're going to have 6 themes or topics for the first 6 months. We'll probably have a theme every month. We're just going to start this way and see how it goes. And we've picked a theme for each of the first 6 gatherings. And I'm going to have Cogen kind of get into those. But the format's going to go, we're going to do just like 5 minutes of just kind of welcome and opening, invocations, perhaps, observances. And then we will get into a discourse, and Cogen will offer a discourse for about 20 minutes, 20 or 30 minutes on the monthly theme. And then the rest of the time, and I may have some reflections as well after that on what he said. And then the rest of the time is going to be just questions, comments. We want to open it up to the gathering, opportunity for mindful sharing, asking for support, offering support in any aspect of veganism, spirituality. It could be, strictly vegan questions. It could be something that you're going through, whatever it is. We want to have a community of support and love for exploring these amazing parallels of veganism and spirituality. So, we're going to have a topic for each month, a theme that we're going to focus on. So, Kojin, would you tell us about the first 6 months of topics, please?
Of course, naturally, our first topic will be ahimsa, nonviolence or non-harming, which again is a very, very important concept in the Dharma traditions. Actually, what the proposition of the Dharma traditions is that they all share is the idea of karma, right? When you do good things come to you. When you do bad things come to you. And ultimately, you want to be free from the vicissitudes of life, the sort of elations of joy that cause complacency, that then cause you to overconsume, which then cause you to fall into depression, the sort of cycles of life where we go up and we go down and we go up and we down. What we do when we're high causes us to go low. What we do when we're low causes us to go high. And that constant cycle of suffering known as samsara related to karma. And so the Dharma traditions all agree that we have to do something about karma, right? We're accountable. We're ultimately accountable for our actions, and that the universe is characterized by having a quality of justice. Justice is not just a social contract. Right and wrong is not just a matter of opinion, but actual right and wrong is built into the fabric of reality, and that is called karma. And so all the Dharma traditions also agree on these various different virtues that we follow that will help us deal with the issues of karma, the negative karma that we have. For example, when we consume even food, when we consume clothing, when we drive a car, anything that involves consumption somewhere on the supply chain, there's going to be an act of violence. There's going to be pollution done to the planet. There's going to be exploited labor. There'll be animals, bugs, plants killed in the process of production, anything. And we're ultimately accountable for all of those things. What to speak of the more overt violent actions that we have when we misuse our anger or when we lash out at others, or maybe even if we commit more overt acts of violence towards people in terms of abuse, physical or emotional, whether intended or unintended. So the Dharma traditions all sort of agree with that. And they also agree on the values that we can practice, the things that we can cultivate to help sort of purify our karma so that we're no longer creating harm towards others. We're no longer creating acts of violence, or at least at best, we're mitigating the violence that we commit, even in our smallest daily actions. And so the main way that this is done is through a principle called Ahimsa, nonviolence, non-harming, which I think most people know about. Ahimsa paramo dharma, nonviolence or non-harming, is the highest principle on the spiritual path. Ahimsa paramo dharma. So we'll discuss that and the importance of that virtue within the Dharma traditions in our own daily practices and our own daily cultivation of awareness, right? Because spirituality really requires a deep sense of awareness of how our actions are affecting others, all the possible ramifications of harms that we're engaged in, and even the most mundane daily actions, and how we can mitigate that and offset that with other actions. And related to that is our
And
second.
I just would love to add the reason that we are calling it the Ahimsa living circle. Most people don't know this word outside of Jain or vegan circles. But within Jain circles, of course, they know the word because it is just central to the religion. But in vegan circles, it's very interesting how this word is very common. You'll see this word on t-shirts, at veg fests. Vegan groups will name their Facebook group Ahimsa something or other. It's really interesting how the vegan community has really adopted this word, taken on this word. I think that there's just no real English equivalent. We've got nonviolence and we've got vegan, but there's something about ahimsa that takes it to this other level, a beautiful, larger spiritual, metaphysical level. And I really want us to dig in deeper so that the vegans understand what this concept is, where it comes from, the tradition that it comes from, and what it truly means. So yeah, anyway, I'm excited to dig into that.
Yeah, a lot of commentators on Ahimsa will note that it's actually like a dynamic nonviolence, right? It's stated in the negative, but it's really a positive force. And for example, the way that James would explain that is that all the violent actions that we do have a way of creating karma that sort of obstructs the full expression of the goodness of our soul, the qualities of consciousness, which give us knowledge, the qualities of happiness, and our internal power that we express with like discipline, willpower, or even just the power to change and affect the world. And so through practice in ahimsa, on the one hand, it's a negative because you're stopping as much karma and as much violence as you can, but it's actually a positive quality of the soul because the soul itself is non-violent. And when the soul is not committing any violence at all, its full expression is able to burst forth and create an immense amount of power, which was at the heart of Gandhi's teachings, for example, which he demonstrated in India. So that's ahimsa. And another way that Gandhi demonstrated ahimsa was with our next topic, which is a parigraha. A parigraha, I think, is best defined as sort of like a non-consumerism. A parigraha is sort of like the taking, the grabbing. Gra is the root there. It means like grasping at the world. It's the sort of mistaken belief that the source of our happiness is external to us. And then the next four topics that we'll take are what's called the four bhavanas. Four bhavanas. And the word bhavana means like cultivation. And these are very important principles, which are also shared within the Dharma traditions. So, for example, we see these mentioned in the Yoga Sutra. And a lot of people increasingly are familiar with the Yoga Sutra due to the influence of the modern yoga movement in the West. And it's listed in the Yoga Sutra, Maitri Karuna, Mudita Pekshana, Sukha Dukkha Punya, Punya Vishayanam Bhavanatas, Chitta Prasadam. These are various different virtues that we cultivate, as bhavana, meaning to cultivate, in order to achieve Chitta Prasada. Prasada is like illumination of our internal consciousness. And again, if karma is what restricts the full expression of our consciousness and our ability to know and our ability to learn, right? Karma restricts that. Then through practicing these virtues, which eliminate karma, it allows the internal quality, the internal luminosity, the prasada of our internal consciousness, the light of our consciousness, to express itself more completely. The Buddhists also have this as well. In the Visuddhimagga, for example, it's an old Pali text, has these as the cultivations as well. And some people in the West may have done like metta meditation. Metta is the Pali word for the first of these bhavanas, which is maitri. Maitri. Maitri is related to the word mitra, which means like friend or friendship, right? So maitri is often translated as something like loving kindness, that sort of loving friendship that you have with all beings. The propensity to cultivate kindness and goodwill towards all those living beings. And these are also mentioned not just in the Hindu Yoga Sutra, the Buddhist Visuddhimagga, but these are all mentioned in the Jain Tattvartha Sutra. And the Tattvartha Sutra is one of the most important, perhaps the central text for all of Jains, because all Jains see the Tattvartha Sutra as laying down the core principles of Jainism. And so we have the Visuddhimagga, Yoga Sutra, Jain Tattvartha Sutra, all the traditions mention this there and other places as well too. And so Maitri is the cultivation of kindness and goodwill and a loving spirit towards others. The second one is either karuna or karunya, which is the cultivation of compassion, right? The ability to see that other beings are suffering and to want to have the effort to do something about it. And a lot of times those other beings are suffering because of our own actions, our own sort of inability to express our consumptive urges in a way that reduces harm rather than increases harm, right? So knowing how our own actions are causing suffering to others and how to stop that. But also we can see karuna, compassion, is also sort of the impulse behind a lot of social activism. Okay, so we have maitri, karuna, or karunya, mudita, or mudita is how it's described in the Yoga Sutra, or pramoda is how it's described in the Jain tradition. They're actually both from the same root, mood, right? It's like a sympathetic joy. It's like when you see somebody doing well, you feel good. How many of us have had the experience where we have like a fear of missing out, right? FOMO, where we see somebody doing something great and like we feel bad about it, right? Or we have like a jealousy where we see somebody in our field excelling. We see somebody doing well and we actually don't feel good about it, right? Well, pramoda or mudita is sort of the opposite of that. It's like when we see somebody doing well, when you see somebody doing a nice act, you feel a sense of joy from it, right? And then also conversely, when you yourself do something nice, you feel good. You know, like when you give and it makes you feel good. That's pramoda or mudita. And then the last one is either upeksha, which is how it's talked about in the Yoga Sutra. It's also a word that's common in the Buddhist Rupa Jhanas, upeksha. Jains use a similar word, like a synonym, is madhyastha. Now, madhyastha is a nice way of talking about it because tha means to be placed, madhya means in the middle. Madhyastha means mental equanimity. So when you're confronted with sort of temptations, right? You could do the good thing or the easy thing. It's like I could, bring my own to go where when I go into public, right? That's the good thing to do. Or I could just say, it's too much difficulty. I'll just use single-use plastic and disposable items. So that equanimity that you have is when you're confronted with like the easy choice that actually creates more harm versus the good choice, which might be a little bit more difficult. You're equiposed. That means you're not necessarily tempted by the ease of doing actions that are more violent, right? And you're not necessarily frustrated by the difficulty of taking an action that's going to do less harm. You're sort of equiposed. And if you're equiposed, then you're always going to choose the right thing. you're always going to choose the thing that is the higher good that's going to create the least amount of karma. Because actually, the reason why we create harm and we engage in violence in the first place is because we're not equiposed, is because we, again, back to aparigraha, we're have this belief that if we could just get external things, if we could just consume and consume and consume, that would somehow fulfill our desire. And that desire would be quenched and we wouldn't suffer because of that desire. But that's a finding that all the Dharma traditions reject, is that happiness doesn't lay in external sources, that it ultimately has to be renounced. And that takes us back to our parigraha. So I guess there's a
Mm.
sort of circle, ahimsa, living circle, and that each one of these principles reinforces each other. They're intricately connected. And the more you focus in on ahimsa, and the more you're committed to aparigraha and the other bhavanas, and the more you're committed to maitri or pramoda or karuna, any of these bhavanas, the more you find yourself looking at the centrality of ahimsa as being sort of the hub of that circle, the hub of that wheel of virtue that we're cultivating.
Wow. Beautiful. Well, that was awesome. That was a wonderful taste of what is to come in our Ahimsa Living Circle. Those are the concepts that we're going to start with for the first 6 months, for 6 circles. I'd love to talk about why we want to do the circle a little more, like broaden it a little bit more, about why we want to explore this realm of veganism and spirituality together. And it really is part of my philosophy of activism. And that's around this concept and Cogen, you have really formulated it for me as well. And you often say that we need to change who we are, not just what we do. What we do, what we're doing now, isn't working. It isn't working. We need, I believe, a consciousness shift, a societal, uprising in consciousness, in what our priorities are, in what is important to us. Really embracing our compassionate nature, because we have to have respect and reverence for all life to really turn the corner on every issue we face. I mean, everything from climate disruption to racial divides and racism to the suffering of the animals. I mean, every societal issue that we have, I don't feel that we're going to be able to heal all these major issues without a shift in our psyche, without a shift in our consciousness. And again, I'll say I don't feel that religion or spirituality has to be the way to do this. But for me, for Cogen, for a lot of people, we see spirituality as kind of a natural ally to this shift, or a guidepost, a guideline to helping us get there. A lot of activism, a lot of vegan activism that I see has to do with changing our habits, right? Changing our habits, getting people to eat veggie burgers instead of a beef burger. And that's great. That's part of it. That's important. But I just feel that that is so it's just too easy to slip back into a meat eating culture if that is our only foundation, right? If it's just a habit change, or it's just this product over that product, I think it has to be more of a cultural transformation to what we find important, what we respect, what we hold dear, what we have reverence for. And that needs to be all life on the planet, including the farmed animals. Yeah. Anyway, so that this is all kind of why we want to incorporate ahimsa, incorporate these spiritual concepts into activism, into engaged advocacy.
Yeah, I think this kind of goes back to our Genesis story, though, in a lot of ways. I think it does in your Genesis story as well, too, because so much of what you used to do was sort of protest and legislative, working on legislative campaigns and addressing the what we do as a society. And that's like super important. Like that's critical work that needs to be done. But in isolation, it's limited in its scope, right? And in terms of my Genesis as well too, I kind of got to a certain point where I just wasn't as good at activism as you were. Like I tried to follow you around and do what you were doing and be as supportive and helpful as I could, but it just wasn't speaking to me. But there were other things that spoke to me deeply, like, practicing daily meditation and reciting scriptures and studying and going to school. And so for me, I started taking that path, thinking, well, this is important too. Maybe it doesn't really matter what you do as long as you do it with integrity. As long as you change who you are and you influence other people around you, maybe that's as important as the protesting and the legislation as well, changing who we are. And in some ways, we can even think that what we do is a symptom of who we are. And so if addressing what we do is addressing symptoms, which is critical, anybody who's sick has to address the symptoms, but they also have to address the cause of the disease as well too. And the cause of our social disease, our social maladies, is who we are. So you kind of moved increasingly into vegan education, and you've had incredible results. I mean, look at all the people you reach with your podcast and your books and all of that. And it's important, and you do it in tandem. You still do protests. You still do that as well too. But we've kind of both in our Genesis story decided that we would divert more attention into changing who we are as a culture and who we are as a society. It's funny because in nonviolent studies, when you study how it is to create social change, a lot of those scholars come to the realization that nonviolent civil resistance is the best way to create lasting democratic social change. And in those scholarly discussions, they distinguish between strategic and principled nonviolence. The idea is, do we just use nonviolence as a strategy because we're fighting forces that will outgun us? They have more violent propensity. So if we try to meet violence with a superior force, we'll lose. So is nonviolence just a strategy? Like we just use it because violence wouldn't work? Or do we use nonviolence because of principle? We do it because it's the right thing to do, because we do not want to become like our enemies, or we don't want to become like our opponents or the oppressors that we're resisting. Is it that we do it because it's the right thing to do, principle, or is it just the best strategy? And a lot of ways, those of us who are in the principled nonviolence camp see that as a false binary. And then actually the best strategy is to change who we are, which means to change who we are in terms of our principles. And so it turns out that the best strategy for democratic social change is to be principled, because that changes who we are and who the people around us are, therefore addressing the cause of our social maladies rather than just the symptoms. And so that's an interesting sort of orientation to the rationale and the mission for what we're trying to achieve here with the Ahimsa Living Circle.
Yeah. Yeah. I think what we're going for is something that's a more lasting change. So I think this fundamental foundational change is so important, and in so many aspects, not only just veganism, but for everything that's going on this planet to save this planet. So yeah. And I know we wanted to talk about spiritual veganism, and how that is kind of a path that we're taking, right? Spiritual veganism. What is spiritual veganism? I know a lot of people that for them, veganism is really the only spirituality in a way that resonates with them, right? Now I think that they need to learn more about Jainism, because I think it will, and the Dharma traditions, I think that will help them to connect their own values to a more spiritual tradition. But it's an interesting discussion, like, about spiritual veganism.
Yeah, I think if we're going to throw a term like spiritual veganism out there, I think that it's important to notice that veganism is sort of like a pluralistic tradition, right? There are many different types of veganisms, and there's
Yeah.
not just one veganism, right? And
Yeah.
there's different ways that like we can like look at veganism too. In religious studies, we have some sort of aphorisms that we use where we say religion is whatever religious people say it is. So we can't like take somebody's definition of Islam and say this is the right definition and that one's the wrong definition if we're being objective social scientists, right? It's just whatever Muslims say it is, that's Islam. We can calculate statistically how many people say or whatever. And then also from a social science perspective, we might say, like, let's not essentialize veganism to any one thing, right? Because the essence of veganism might be different for multiple different people. And those are all legitimate definitions of veganism. And then we also might point out from a social science perspective, that veganism doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? It's culturally influenced. That means that people can come to veganism from different perspectives. There are multiple different ways to come to the conclusion or the practices of veganism from very, very different cultural understandings, different moral values, etc. So then I guess as practitioners of veganism, we can try to ask ourselves, well, what is our rationale for veganism? And is it the same as something like speciesism, right? Like, or is it the same as, is it just a boycott? Or is veganism like actually a spiritual path? Is it actually a philosophy? Because we can just look at veganism and say, like, well, veganism is something that we do, right? And then you and I have both pushed back on that. And we've said, actually, we need to address who we are more than what we do. Sure, veganism can just be a boycott of animal products. Sure, it can just be a diet. It can be for some people. It's a pluralistic tradition, and that's fine. But actually, from a spiritual vegan perspective, it's got to be more than what we do. Veganism is actually who we are. So boycotting animal products and veganism, they don't translate. They're not synonymous. The term veganism has more connotation than boycott animal products. It has something to say about who we are when we're discussing spiritual veganism, right? It's a sense of identity. It's a
Or
cultural,
philosophical veganism, right? Too. Yeah.
philosophical veganism,
Yeah.
right? So it can be a personal identity, it can be a cultural and communal identity, but it can also be a philosophical commitment, like a more than a lifestyle choice. It's a moral imperative. We must not create harm for whatever reasons you back up your general ethics. A deontologist will say that for rights reasons. A utilitarian will say that for utilitarian reasons. You must not do harm. But then, as a spiritual vegan, we might say, from the perspective of karma, we must not do harm because we don't want to incur karma. That's a broader statement. There's more to that statement than just like, I don't want to eat animal products and I'm boycotting animal products, or I'm just eating this way for my health. Those both are forms of veganism, but spiritual veganism is going to take into account these sort of more moral imperatives and perhaps ones that have spiritual connotations.
Mm.
Now, one might ask, well, what's the difference between spirituality and a philosophy? Right? I can have a philosophical veganism following Tom Regan or Peter Singer, animal rights or do the least harm, right? That's a philosophical perspective. But what makes a perspective spiritual? Again, spirituality is a broader rubric. Philosophy is part of spirituality, but spirituality does something that philosophy doesn't. Spirituality does what we call soteriology. It sort of embeds our personal narrative in a grand narrative of the cosmos, which proposes that we have purpose in this life that extends beyond this individual life. It extends into something of an afterlife, right? It's a proposition of metaphysical systems. They may involve personal gods, it may involve personal forces, but it can also be impersonal forces. And it can be how our soul moves through this reality beyond our own limited individual life. So that idea of freeing ourselves from pain, not just in this life, but in beyond, that's what spirituality does that philosophy doesn't. And so that's what we're proposing with spiritual veganism, is that it's the broadest possible rubric of defining veganism. It includes within it veganism as a boycott, veganism as a diet, veganism as personal identity, veganism as cultural communal identity, veganism as a philosophy, but then beyond that, it's a way of care, of self-care, not just for ourselves and all around us, but a self-care for the aggregate of reality that's going to make it so that we're not harming, so that we benefit beyond this life, beyond this individual life. And that's what makes it a spirituality.
Yeah, I've heard people kind of push back on the karma aspect and say, well, that's a selfish reason to not eat animals, just for your own karmic good. But it's not selfish. It has everything to do with compassion and not wanting to cause suffering. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean,
How karma is not selfish?
yeah. It's I mean, it's a false binary, right?
Yeah.
It's either you're helping others or you're helping yourself. If you're helping yourself, then your emphasis is not on helping others. But what do you do when the thing that's in the best interest for you is helping others? Like, how do you describe that? Like, it's both selfless and selfish at the same time and in different ways. On the one hand, you might be like, look, I'm really going to focus on purifying my karma, not creating action so I can have the broadest expression of my internal goodness, right? Karma theory 101. But then that process is a hyper awareness, a hyper mindfulness to all that's around you, all of existence, all of what the living beings are feeling, right? So is that really selfish? Like, how do you like it's just a really strange definition of selfishness if your selfishness involves an acute awareness and sensitivity to reducing the harm of those around you. That's a very peculiar definition of selfishness. So
Right.
karma theory, I don't think can be defined as selfishness, or at least if somebody defines it that way, I would say it's a very bad definition of karma theory that really doesn't cohere with the broader traditions of Hindu, Jain, and Buddhist discourse.
Agreed. Agreed. Yeah, going back to my origin of spirituality, I remember when you first introduced to me karma theory, I was like, ah, okay. I already had that. Like I already knew that somehow. I just didn't know what it was called. I didn't realize that there was an entire tradition, numerous religions that believed in it. But I felt that already. And suddenly I had a name for it, karma.
Yeah, I mean, it really does go back to your Genesis story when you're 8 years old and you knew right from wrong. You knew there was nothing wrong with expressing joy through movement, and you knew that it was wrong to harm animals and that they must have a life or a soul in the same sense that humans do. I mean, that's really a brilliant part of your Genesis, how early you realize that. And so when I look for evidence for the idea that like we live in a just universe, right? That's the proposition that I make, and that's essential to spirituality. It's the foundation of karma theory, is that justice is not a social construct, not merely a social construct. It's not merely a personal decision or opinion, that actually justice is the nature of reality. It's the quality that defines reality the best. And I think that there's evidence in that with the perceptions of children, because they feel justice with such force and vivacity that it's akin to any other form of evidence we have. Like if seeing is believing, like I know there's a cup on my table because of the force with which the impression of a cup hits me, right? Other than that, how else do I know? Like maybe I'm imagining it, maybe I'm stuck in the Matrix machine and there's no cup there at all. I mean, you can doubt anything, right? But is it rational doubt? Like, is it good doubt? Because if you just start doubting everything, you become ignorant because you can't maintain any knowledge, right? So I'm just going to assume that there's a cup on my table because the force with which that impression hits me. Well, what about other impressions that hit us? Like 8-year-old Hope gets hit with the force that it's okay to express yourself through movement. That's not wrong, right? You had a sense of right and wrong. It's wrong to hurt animals. What about that force? Can we say that that's a sensory perception akin with the force with which our sight and our hearing and our touch hits us? And I would say argue yes. And I've argued that in my book on Bhakti ethics. And Ira Glass actually did a really cool This American Life episode where he installed a telephone in a kindergarten class. And he said the kids, anytime they want to tattletale, they could pick up the phone. And this was in response to like kindergarten teachers getting so frustrated that the kids are just coming to tattletale to them all day long. Tattletale, tattletale. Like the majority of conversations that you have as a kindergarten teacher is with kids tattletaling on other kids. And they decided that the best way to deal with them is just give them a phone to pick up the phone. And then so there's this really charming episode of all these kids picking up the phone and tattletaling and tattletaling. Now, what that told me is that this sense that justice is real, is so forceful for young children. It is such a strong sensory perception that it provides evidence for the proposition that we live in a just universe. Right?
That
Yeah,
things should be fair.
it should be fair. We know that.
Yeah.
Know that with the same way that we know that I smell dinner being cooked, or I know that I'm in a bright room, or I know that I hear a loud sound. I know that the world should be fair. Why would we discount that impression and elevate other impressions? And
Mm.
that's like a lot of what my academic work has gone to show. So
Yeah. Karma is cosmic justice.
yeah, and it has to be cosmic. It has to be beyond this lifetime. Because in this life, if justice is real, if we accept that argument that justice is real, karma is real, then we have to look around and we see the good things happen into bad things and bad things happen into good people. We
Right.
see
Bad things happening to good people, good things happening to bad people.
yes,
Yes.
exactly.
Yeah.
But when you understand that, yes, justice is part of reality, then the projection of right and wrong has to extend beyond an individual life. So, first accepting the proposition that we live in a just universe, then allows us to accept the proposition that we have life beyond this and that we reincarnate. And that's sort of the logic that these Dharma traditions follow.
Wonderful. Well, we are going to get into all of this in the Ahimsa Living Circle. Really, I think, and we did say this a little bit, but I want to kind of maybe end with this, that ultimately we want this to be a community supported space, right? A community space where we can, combine our knowledge and have deep, thoughtful conversations. We want everyone to get involved and if you feel comfortable to contribute. We want our Hunta students and the larger community to join us on this kind of journey of discovery, discovering how we can do better, how we can be better, better humans walking gently and with humility and kindness on this planet. So we want you to share what you know, be a guide to each other, and support each other and work for a truly, truly compassionate world. It's really a fruition of our 25-year marriage and relationship and building these two worlds paralleled, your spiritual knowledge, my vegan knowledge, coming together and sharing it with a community. So I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, and it's also really great to sort of invite the participation in a democratic way. It's not just going through this top-down hierarchy where you come and listen to a sermon. We'll have prepared talks and such, but really the idea is to have people express themselves, to bring their own questions and their own thoughts into this, and to sort of co-create fellowship together in a way that's democratic, in a way that allows people to have a space where they can really feel invited and inspired, both spiritually and ethically and otherwise.
Yeah. When my grandmama Opal was still alive, she was the one that was very deeply religious and took me to church all the time. I would move around a lot when I was in my early 20s, like late teens, early 20s. And every time I moved to a new area and I'd talk to my grandmama that I had just moved, she'd say, "Have you found a church home, honey? Have you found a church home?" And at the time, I was completely non-religious and atheist and not, but I'd always say, no, well, I'll look around, grandmama. I'll think about that. Well, this is kind of what we want to create. We want our church home, but rooted in the Dharma traditions, rooted in veganism and our beliefs and our values. So we hope that we can extend that to others to kind of come together with us in a church home. So I hope you'll join us for our Ahimsa Living Circle. It's going to be the second Saturday of every month, starting in the new year. The first circle will start on Saturday, January 11th in 2025. It's going to be 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern, and you can register through Arihanta Institute, and we will have a link in the show notes to be able to register. And I'm just so grateful, Cogen, that you're going to be taking the time to do this. You're, I know, incredibly busy, but it's exciting that our worlds are now really coming together to create something beautiful.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be part of it. I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's the fruition of something that's been a long time in the coming.
Yes, yes, wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much, Cogen. Thanks for being on the podcast.
It was my absolute pleasure. Thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. If you would like to hear more about the Dharma traditions, if you're curious about Jainism, if you want to know more about Ahimsa, this beautiful concept of nonviolence, non harming, and how we can live fulfilled lives of compassion and kindness, please join us. You don't have to be vegan. You don't have to be spiritual. Just maybe curious about these things. We'd love to have you. I hope you join us for our very first one on January 11th, Saturday, January 11th. And we will have a link in the show notes to where you can register. If you know someone who might find this all interesting, please share this podcast with them. Share the information about the Ahimsa Living Circle with them. We'd love to have them. So I can't wait to share another year of podcasting with you, another year of exploring incredible advocacy, ways that we can be inspired to do more for animals. I hope that 2025 will bring us even closer to animal freedom and to a just, compassionate vegan world. And please live vegan.